Teddy Roosevelt, and this building took quite some time to build. In fact, this building wasn't completed until 1975. The landmark itself is approximately 2.8 million square feet. J. Edgar Hoover is actually responsible for some of the most interesting tactics in FBI history. One of which is actually COINTELPRO, where he had investigations on the vast majority of our civil rights leaders that it includes, but is not limited to, pioneers in music like Aretha Franklin. As we navigate through this area of Washington, D.C., if you look to you guys' left-hand side, you can see a light gray hotel. It's known as the Waldorf Astoria, but that's the new identity. In fact, this building was actually just purchased by an African-American corporation out of Texas. Prior to it being known as the Waldorf Astoria, it actually had a different name. It was called the Trump Hotel. Interestingly enough, it has existed since 1889, not as the Trump, but as a post office. It's dedicated to Nancy Hanks, the person who saved it from being demolished in 1994. If you look to your left-hand side here, you can see the largest federal building we have in the Washington, D.C. area. This is called the Ronald Reagan International Trade Center. The landmark itself is actually 3.1 million square feet, and there's only one federal building in this country, in this local area, that's larger than it. That would be the Pentagon. 6.5 million square feet. The Pentagon is so large it occupies 6 different zip codes. What's interesting about this community, or this area that we call the Federal Triangle, is that this is the basis of a lot of the most influential civil rights movements in American history. In fact, where the plaza with the jump houses for the youth, that's actually where Dr. Ronald D. King started his march on Washington. 1963, actually took 250,000 people from here to the Lincoln Memorial, where he would give what we call the I Have a Dream speech. What's significant about this plaza is that it's actually dedicated to him. It was dedicated to Dr. King in 1988. Specifically, it also features a time capsule, which is a 100-year time capsule. But Dr. King wasn't the first person to actually march on Washington successfully. It just so happened to be his mentor. This is why I brought up the Pentagon shortly ago, because A. Philip Randolph in 1941 launched the March on Washington so that the military can be completely desegregated. And because of this March on Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for the first time, passed a presidential executive order so that African Americans can enlist. It's called Executive Order 8802, but this area just gets more amazing. In fact, if you look to your left-hand side, you can see the 14th Street logo. Under the 14th Street sign, it says Ron Brown, and Ronald Brown is an African American Secretary of Commerce. He's actually the only Secretary of Commerce in recorded American history to see the economy balanced. He didn't have a long-lived legacy. In fact, he was actually known for being elected by Bill Clinton, and he passed away in a plane crash heading to Croatia in 1996. But in American history, there was only one president to see us make money. His name is Andrew Jackson. There was only one president to balance the books. His name is Bill Clinton. But the street, it has a duality to its history. So 14th Street in Washington, D.C. history is also known as Murder's Bay. This is, in fact, where the vast majority of the homicides would take place in the District of Columbia in the 1800s. But if you look to your right-hand side, you can see a plaza called John Black Jack Pershing's Park. Also to your right-hand side, behind the plaza, you can see 2 hotels that look like it's a part of one building, but there's a color variation. See, the Marble Hotel is called the Willard. That's the oldest continuously functioning hotel we have in the entire District of Columbia. It's been around since 1850. That's significant because it hints at a window of time that you can understand the construction workers better. Saying it without saying only one sentence that was written down. It was the first. He says, 5 score year ago, a great American signs the Emancipation Proclamation. Everything from that point was an improvisation. It was actually even stated that Mahalia Jackson gestures to him and says, tell them about your dream. Because Dr. Martin Luther King actually gave an I Have a Dream speech 3 times. The first time he gave one was in North Carolina. The second time he gave one was in Detroit, Michigan. And the last time he would give a variation of an I Have a Dream speech. Hey, sir, from Manchester. When the bus is moving, you gotta remain seated, bro.
Oh, sorry.
All right, I appreciate that, man. But if I hit the brakes and you flipped over, that wouldn't have been a wipeout. It would have been road rash. As you travel past this point, if you look to your left-hand side, you can see the African American History and Culture Museum. That landmark is pretty amazing. Externally, it's designed like a Western African crown. It's called a Yoruban Kuriyata with the Corona accent, designed by David Ajay, who has Nigerian citizenship. The landmark itself includes some of the most prolific artifacts we have known to African American history, including Chuck Berry's red Cadillac. But for me personally, looking at the panels is the most symbolic thing. because that's the direct reflection of the tribal wardrobes of people who were imported to Louisiana and South Carolina. So before you enter the museum, it's a reminder, subtly and also directly, that African American origin stories never started on American soil. One of the biggest contributors to the existence of that museum was Oprah. She donated over the time period of it being designed $21 million. As we make this right hand turn to your left, you can see the Washington Monument. It's typically referred to as an obelisk. What's interesting about the Washington Monument is that the term obelisk is its second identity. In fact, originally, it would have been called a tekinu. The oldest structure like this known to recorded history is Hammurabi's Code from Mesopotamia. So that's African. What's interesting about this one is that it's different from your traditional obelisk because it's not carved out of one slab of stone. It's made of many individual pieces. So that means it's not a monolith. It's more of an American mantra. That mantra is e pluribus unum. That indicates out of many you have one. But we have arrived at our first photo opportunity. Actually going to the White House. Come on down. Acres, it's 55,000 square feet. So how they designed it is that nature actually is one of its defenses. The building has 412 doorways, 147 windows, 132 rooms, 35 bathrooms, 28 fireplaces, 6 stories, 8 stairwells, and 3 elevators.
Wow.
There's a total staff of 90, a kitchen staff of 5 chefs. There's approximately 3,200 Secret Service agents around you right now, 1,000 in plain clothes. And I say all of that because it's important to note exactly how massive a building is and also understand how much of it was completed before the Civil War. That's a very direct timestamp before Reconstruction. And so the first White House was started in 1792 and it was completed in 1800. Then the first White House, because of the Second War against Great Britain in 1812, was burned down in 1814. Had to be completely rebuilt. It was finished in 1826, and then during the Civil War, there was an expansion project that was started and paused. It wasn't finished until 1870. White House was burned down again in 1929, not because of a military action, but because of a presidential accident. Herbert C. Hoover, he burned down the White House on Christmas Eve.
Wow.
This is the last part of the White House to exist. It's called the Harry S. Truman Portico. It was completed in 1948, and the vast majority of society, no matter where you're from, remembers this side of the White House because of a TV show called Scandal. This is where Olivia Pope would complain about choosing to be a side piece. And never mind. All right.
I hate that show.
It's like, wait.
You chose this.
You chose your path, ma'am. Just relax.
Right.
Take the payments he's giving you and go off into the sunset. All right? No monicking around. No, but the depth behind the understanding of the architecture and the size and the process of building it is also understanding that this building was built by an Irishman. His name was James Oban, and he was actually paid for an unoriginal design. So he goes back to his homeland, that finds the most sophisticated building he thinks is sophisticated. He redraws it, adds some frail to it. He comes to the United States of America. He wins the $500 contest. He's committed as the designer of the White House. But because he's the designer, that means he's also a part of the construction process. That means he also can manipulate the labor force. So he has a contract with the Treasury Office. It said that he would be paid $60 per every person he would bring to build the White House. For every year they build the White House. So he brought over 200 slaves. That was retroactively paid to be worth $83 million.
Wow.
So that's why the architecture of the White House is important. And the first African American person to be actually invited to the building didn't take place until the building was 102 years old. His name was Booker T. Washington. He got a formal presidential invitation from Teddy Roosevelt. What's interesting about the White House's legacy is that at that point it was an open door policy. Even during the Civil War, there was pioneers who dared to go inside, including one person who was a fugitive. His name was Frederick Douglass. He met with Abraham Lincoln 3 times. What's significant about Frederick Douglass's journey to liberation is that he had to move to the UK. He spent 2 years abroad because there was a bounty on him, and when he returns back to the United States of America, he literally purchases his freedom for $781. Civil War ensues, and he actually speaks to Abraham Lincoln about the necessity of using the African Americans as a means of winning the war. But Abraham Lincoln didn't do so until absolutely necessary. We're going to get into that later. But I want to speak about Frederick Douglass, is where he's from and how it correlates to where you are right now. He's from Touir County, Eastern Shore. And exactly where he was born is the reason why Washington, D.C. is shaped this way. How?
If you ever look at an original map of Washington in 1790, it was a completed diamond. If you look at a map of Washington, D.C., everything south of the Potomac River was given back in 1847. The reason why is it was affecting their agricultural economy. Because in the year 1800, Congress made it illegal for humans to be imported from Africa for the use of slavery. That doesn't mean you couldn't manufacture them. Where Frederick Douglass is from, Touir County, Eastern Shore, it wasn't known for its massive agriculture. It was actually wheat there, but it was a human breeding ground because the southern tip of Maryland sits off of the main shore. See, the Potomac River goes straight through it, and so there's a gap in between the Chesapeake Bay and parts of Maryland and parts of the United States of America. So it's like their own private oasis. By the age of 6 or 8, you would be imported to Northern Virginia, Alexandria, or Baltimore, where Frederick Douglass went. So it was affecting their economy so much that they asked for it back, and by 1850 they figured out a way to fix the entire problem. They passed a fugitive slave law. It means this entire city is actually built based on accommodating the southern economy. And then if you look to the left-hand side of the White House, you can see a large gray building. It's called the Dwight D. Eisenhower office. He's actually the first president to hire an African-American as a staff member. His name was E. Frederick Morrow in 1955. That building is currently being used as the vice president's workspace. First ever African-American female vice president, Kamala Harris, Howard University graduate. But in order to give her credence, you have to speak about the first person in black history to actively run for president. She was an African-American woman. Her name was Shirley Chisholm. She became the first black woman to be elected to Congress in 1968, and she had a presidential run in 1974. It was only a decade later that somebody tried to redo that. His name was Jesse Jackson. 1984, this is when he created the Rainbow Push organization. He was also known as the Shadow Senator of Washington, D.C. We also have to pay homage to Frederick Douglass because he was so much of a pioneer of his time, he was written in onto the ballot. He was also a vice presidential elect under a woman in 1848. Her name was Victoria Woodhull. What's interesting about this location, this long plot of grass that looks vacant right now, is actually Civil War history. In fact, during the Civil War, this is where Abraham Lincoln would test fire the first machine gun ever. It was called the Gatling gun. It shot over 200 rounds in 1 minute, and it was actually a hand crank weapon. Here, south of us, the National Mall, is where General George McClellan would have over 100,000 troops. With the exception of the African Americans who were able to enlist after 1863, they were actually trained on islands. We have an island here. It's called Roosevelt's Island. Historically, it was a Prince Hall Mason Island. The black Masons, and that's where the first colored troops of Washington, D.C. were trained. Significantly enough, to weaponize a person of African American heritage means you had the fear of turning the gun. And so you had to be trained off site. So if you go to New York, there's a famous island there. It has a different legacy today, where Rikers Island was started as an African American military base. Welcome to the Black History Tour. From here, we're actually going to Lincoln. And of course, I have a few questions. So when you look to your left-hand side, you're going to see a bridge. But pay attention to the opposite side of the bridge because it's leading you somewhere. In fact, you can see a yellow house. It's called the Arlington House. That's the estate of Robert E. Lee. So once we get through this line of trees, you look to your left, you can see the Arlington House. Because before Arlington Cemetery became a cemetery, it was used as a village. It was called Freedmen's Village, and in fact, if you go there today, you can still find that it's called Section 27. It has 1,500 graves, and the vast majority of the graves in Section 27 are unmarked because the people buried there are African American. One of the most prolific humans lived there when it was a community. Her name is Sojourner Truth. She's known for earning the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Barack Obama. She gave the A9 Women's Speech in Akron, Ohio, 1851. We have a ton of police out right now. That makes me so excited.
It's police week.
Yeah, it is. Most of them were on my flight. Some of them, a lot of them were on my flight. Yeah, I got a shares.
Thing is under a mass redevelopment. They're trying to just beautify the city, but it's a perpetual thing. I guess Washington D.C. is where the Kardashians get their ideas from. I'm joking. I'm joking. But they're trying to prepare for a day in Washington. So on July 4th to 2026, it'll be the 250th year anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So they're actually trying to make everything great before that moment happens in time. Of course, when you look at the Lincoln Memorial, it takes you all the way back to Athens, Greece. This is a Greek structure. The best way to understand it is Hercules, right? Remember when he discovered he was a demigod and he went on a quest to find his dad and he landed upon a temple that had torches on both sides, and when he started walking up the stairs, they lit? This one is a little different because it can't be a religious or ceremonial place. And so if you look under every state at the top, it has Roman numerals. So they actually fuse mythology. This is what you have. This is how you get the understanding of neoclassical. As it pertains to this memorial, this is the very location where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave 6 speeches. The last time he was here was 2 months before he was killed, and it wasn't the I Have a Dream speech. In that speech, he essentially says, "We shall overcome because the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." The arc of the moral universe. I don't like to misquote MLK. The last time he was in Washington, D.C. was about a week before he was killed. He was at the National Cathedral. He says, "Because of America's technological and scientific genius, we've made this world a neighborhood or accessible. But because of a lack of a commitment to morality, we haven't made it a brotherhood." He was one of the most prolific people you actually discover. And the reason why he became a civil rights leader is purely accidental. A family tragedy. In fact, when he was 12, as a kid would do, instead of reporting straight home, he went to a parade. But his family took shifts, and they were supposed to give their grandfather his supplementation of Bayer aspirin because he has a heart condition. And Dr. Martin Luther King didn't go home because he thought he's fine. Someone would actually get him his aspirin if I don't show up, and his grandfather died.
Wow.
And so Dr. Martin Luther King always felt like he was missing in the most important moment of his family's life, so he would never go missing for society. Dr. Martin Luther King gave his first speech when he was 15. It was at an elk convention in Atlanta, Georgia, and the first thing he says, the first speech he would ever give, was titled, as a high school student, "The Negro versus the Constitution."
Wow.
So his trajectory is amazing. As it pertains to understanding Arlington Cemetery a little better, as an encampment site, they had 2 churches, a school, and a hospital, but Washington, D.C. had 68, which is why Howard University exists. It wasn't always a college, it was a hospital for African-American military. It was called Freedmen's Hospital, and when Abraham Lincoln was shot at the Forest Theater, they enlisted 2 of the surgeons to save his life. One was a black Canadian, his name was Anderson Ruffin Abbott. The other one was from Norfolk, Virginia. His name was Alexander Augusta. He goes on to become the first African-American officer to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. He taught as a professor of medicine at Howard for 10 years. From here, though, I'm going to cross the entire Lincoln Memorial just so I can take you to the Vietnam Memorial, because all of this history is linked. Follow me. Me too. So on the inside, you'll see how the Washington Monument acts to the moon as the U.S. Capitol acts to the sun. If you walk horizontally across the National Mall, which is actually French, it means long plot of grass, you'll see the Washington Monument is perfectly symmetric enough to completely hide the U.S. Capitol dome.
Why don't we stand? That's a good spot for a picture, though. Why don't you guys stand there? Oh, man, so bad.
Oh, sorry guys.
I'm not the worst.
This is a very ancient concept. So the obelisk in true world history They're actually meant to be paired. So it's not common, except in Western culture, that you'll find obelisks as individual pieces of art. So we actually have two. You see one standing, then one in the reflection pool. That's as above, so below. So when it was designed by Pierre Laporte originally, he had a concept of the use of the number 5. The degree of 5, it actually correlates with rebirth. So everything in Washington, D.C. has that nuance. So when you were at the White House, I told you to settle on 55,000 square feet of land. The Washington Monument is exactly 555 feet tall, 55 feet wide. The Pentagon is 5-sided with 5 floors externally and 5 rings around the structure. The African American History and Culture Museum sits on the last 5 acres of national mall space. What's interesting about Pierre Lapointe's original design is that he never actually gave it to this country so he can build this city. He kept it to himself. And the only reason why we have that design is because of the photographic memory of a black man.
Wow.
His name was Benjamin Banneker. He was classified as an astronomer. He referenced the design and he only took 2 days to redraw this entire city.
That's crazy.
So because of this, he was able to be what they call the overseer of Washington, D.C. He was even hired by somebody who thought that certain people couldn't be intellectuals. He was hired by Thomas Jefferson. And so with that, Benjamin Banneker also, later in life, would accurately predict the solar eclipse. And he sent that very almanac to Thomas Jefferson. In the 1790s, he says, it's not because of the person, it's because of access and opportunity. You can't expect someone to be in a degraded position for over 200 years and achieve something that someone accomplishes when they became wealthy at 14. When you look behind you, you can see the Lincoln Memorial, where you can see the tan meet the white marble. That's where Dr. King.
Yeah.
In fact, if you walk straight up, right beside the panel gate, you'll see an inscription. Dr. Martin Luther King, I have a dream speech. And after we go to Vietnam, I'm going to take you to that very point, all right? Specifically this part of the Vietnam Memorial, because it assists you in understanding the wall better. So every additional piece of the memorial site actually adds to the allure of the wall. But in order to understand it, you have to also understand the nuance of the wall. So this is a wall that was dedicated in 1982. It was designed by Maya Lin, who was a Yale undergrad, and she completed her design when she was only 21 years old.
Wow.
So there's a few layers to her art specifically. This is an ordered memorial. It's actually based on first to last death sequence. It's a V for Valor. You're also walking into a trench. But the most important aspect of her memorial design is the fact that when viewable from above, it looks like a scar of earth. The permanent stain left on the soil of America. One of the things that she did intentionally, which shows a granite material that reflects quite well, is from India. This gives you a chance at introspection. You can actually understand the feelings you have based on the lives that were lost. Typically, people lose sight of these lives because they don't understand them to be children. These were teenagers. They think they're war-hardened military. The average age of a name on that wall is 19.
Wow.
So this is why this was added, designed by Frederick Hart 2 years after the memorial site. This gives you access to understanding the diversity and the loss of innocence of the military. So you can see 3 ethnicities. You also have to quantify that this war was fought in the 60s, so these gentlemen, at least on American soil, wouldn't have been in the same place. You had the Kennedy assassination, the assassination of Malcolm X, Dr. King, Fred Hampton, Julie P. Newton, Medgar Evers. And then you see Latino on the far left-hand side, knowing that we had very strained relationships at that time. Interestingly enough, this is a way for them to acquire American citizenship. Latino families would join the military so they can become Americanized. You can see the gentleman on the far left-hand side. He's Latino, but he's also heavy artillery. Over his right shoulder, he's holding an M60. That's a 7.62 round. That's a 2-man job. But one of the most impactful things about this memorial is that they actually tell you whether they made it home. When you look at the Latino statue, you can see he doesn't have a dog tag across his chest. You also see he doesn't have a dog tag in his boot. Standard issue, active duty military, you're required to have 2 dog tags. You're supposed to put one on your chest, you're supposed to put one on your boot, because if you're hit with an RPG, the article of clothing that's the most likely to remain intact is a shoe. Take the dog tag from the lace of your shoe, put it vertically in your front teeth, slam your jaw shut so it cannot be removed. Then in the center, you can see a Marine. He's also telling you something. The angel is in the details. When you look at the details of the Marine in the middle, you can see he's completely unarmed. His sidearm holster is vacant, but he does have something Latino doesn't. He has his dog tag in his right shoelace. That means he represents the POW. There's actually 1,200 POWs on that wall, present day America. And then on the far right hand side, you can see the African American. The face of it is Scotty Dillingham, and in 1982, he stood for this image at 15. The story behind the youngest person to die for America in Vietnam is that he enlisted at 14.
Damn.
He was actually from Greensboro, North Carolina. He was able to successfully enlist because of a tactic America used to get more recruits. It was called the 100,000 Project, where you can not have the same IQ needs to join the military. What's unique about his statue is that he's also holding the worst weapon you can have in service. See that assault rifle? That's an M16. And why that's the worst weapon is because it was designed by a toy company. It was actually designed by Mattel. All the plastic components of that weapon were actually manufactured by the same company that makes Barbie, present day. So in the war, they also used a powder coating that caused the weapon to jam. We were only able to fix this in 1972, but that's only 1 year before Richard Nixon decided to establish a Vietnamization, where we actually left the conflict to the Vietnamese. But in the artistic interpretation, he's the only one that makes it back. You can also see he's carrying his brother's dog tag across his chest. Because in the heart of war, the heat of battle, if you can't take the remains, you snatch what you can remember from it. What's interesting about this wall is that it's perpetual. This is the only memorial that is still adding names. You can still die of a war that ended 50 years ago. It just looks different. It's called Agent Orange. Looks like type 2 diabetes and a spectrum of cancer. So when this wall was dedicated, there was 57,939 names. Today there's 58,381 and counting. What's interesting about Agent Orange is that it's something that's systemic. You can literally give it to the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation. It just looks like autism and ADHD. If you study the education system, directly after the Vietnam War ended, there was a spike in autism and ADHD. And it wasn't until last year, government passed a law so that the veterans can get 100% of their benefits. So this is still modern America. From here, I want to show you a component that's actually dedicated to the Agent Orange losses. This small little placard. It says, in the memory of the men and women who served in the Vietnam War and later died as a result of their service, we honor and remember their sacrifice. I spent a lot of time to figure out a way to make this experience palatable. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of the components of this war, it's really hard to digest. So one of the most interesting things about the military history is that branches or regiments weren't integrated until about 1950. Harry S. Truman, Executive Order 9981, and it wasn't followed through with until about 1967. In fact, you're from the South. There's a draft board leader. His name was Jesse Helms. He was a part of the Louisiana draft until 1966 when he stepped down. That means he would strategically draft a certain person. How would that look? African Americans only accounted for 16% of the military, one of the lowest populations, but African Americans were 24% of the combat troops. That means if you were black in Vietnam, you were most likely on the front line. They were called bullet catchers.
Wow.
Air quotes. What's unique about this phenomenon is that even in war, you had to have a certain trust for the person you were standing beside, and in most cases that wouldn't be true. So there was instances of friendly fire. How does that look like in society today? Have you ever met somebody and you forged such a close relationship with them, you gave them a customized handshake?
Yeah.
That came from Vietnam. The concept of adapt came from African Americans in Vietnam because you wanted to say your last farewell to somebody, or you wanted to have somebody watch your six without everybody knowing, so you would give them a special handshake. That literally came from this war, and when these veterans came home, they were spat upon and called kid killers, which is one of the biggest American ironies ever. So they didn't even have support for this wall. The only reason why it exists is because they funded them themselves. They paid $9 million so they can honor themselves. And you can't speak about Vietnam without discussing the nurses. So at about I guess 2 o'clock, you can see the Women's Nurse Memorial because there's 8 nurses on that wall. We actually deployed 6,000 female nurses to Vietnam, and the average age of a nurse in Vietnam was 24. Before they served in war, they only had 2 years of nursing experience. And when they went to Vietnam, there was 1 nurse to 70 beds. But they were extremely successful. In fact, if you went to a hospital in Vietnam, had a 98% chance of surviving. And when they came home, they were only offered clerical roles. Not only was there an ethnicity caste system, there was a gender caste system. So this entire site is one of the most honorable things because it showcases being triumphant through adversity. You wouldn't have a Magnolia Lily, one of the best nurses in Vietnam history, if she didn't go through so much adversity that she had to be a perfectionist. So when you look at this wall, it's to showcase the military fortitude that continues. From here, we're actually going to go to the Lincoln. And that's actually the first window into seeing how minorities were treated in war. Here's a name you guys know, quite casually. His name is Biggie Smalls. And how history works, that you don't know that name because of his military history, you know it through hip hop. The first Biggie Smalls is from South Carolina, Beaufort. He was a slave, a deckhand on a ship called the Planter, and he was considered to be functionally illiterate, air quotes. So he used that understanding of his brain against the entire crew. He was actually meticulously learning that ship. He learned it so well, he got in with the captain. He got so close to the captain, he identified the signals he was using to exit the port. He stole the ship.
Wow.
He gives it to the Union forces, and because he knew the ship so well, they make him the captain of that ship. He becomes a spy. He does 17 successful missions. He retires with the Congressional Medal of Honor. Still, nobody knows him. His name is the notorious Robert Biggie Smalls, and in black history, he's the first black politician in the state of South Carolina.
Amazing.
From here, we go to the Lincoln. So we can put our feet where Dr. King put his feet. Out of water, but it is tradition that you take and you wet it so you can see the inscription. So, now that I have you guys here, you guys have successfully landed Dr. Martin Luther King was. I want to give you guys a chance to become free range ticket. Okay.
That's why he started to give a speech.
Huh?
His I have a dream.
Yeah.
That's it. That's enough. Grandma say, make it work, boy. Right. So this is exactly where he was. He was in alignment in front of the Washington Monument, standing right in front of Abraham Lincoln. So, with this in mind, time right now is 11:05. I just need you guys to be back on the bus at no later than 11:25. I'll make it really easy for you. The Washington Monument is at 12 o'clock, and the bus is at 2 o'clock. All right? See you guys soon.
Cool. Thank you.
What time did you say? 11:25.
11:25.
Don't say Ben gets single. 25. Yeah, the restrooms
That's
are
right.
back by the bus.
Oh, they are?
Yeah, so when you come down the stairs, right beside the bus is the green building, and that's the restroom.
We're going this way, Chester.
I'm gonna try record this a little bit better. This is where Martin Luther stood. Yeah, I think I can see it now properly. Yeah.
August 28, 1963.
1963. So this is where he stood, and that's where he, obviously like 100,000 of African Americans just there listening to him and his beautiful speech. And right there is the monument, and right behind me is Lincoln, where we're gonna go now. That's very interesting. My nigga stood there. He had a dream. Huh? Yeah, there's a construction going on, so you can't really there's a construction going on, so the building is really a Greek inspired. They just did it the way they did it and put Lincoln in here. Can I get in my frame?
Give me the frame.
Do you want to get in the frame? I don't know if you can see him properly, but we got Abraham behind us. Should have reverted with that name.
Abraham.
Huh?
Ibrahim.
Should have become Ibrahim, but hey, what you gang?
Abraham Lincoln was able to keep the Union intact, so they made his memorial for tourists from different parts of the country. Just like this one. So half of this memorial is enshrined to commemorate his legacy. So on the left-hand side, you can see a wall of just quotes. There's only 14 because Dr. Martin Luther King only spent 14 years in the general public. There's 6 on this side, and across the mountain, there's actually 8 because the year he was assassinated is 1968. But this shaded pathway here takes you through to the understanding they have of Dr. Martin Luther King. So, in Dr. Martin Luther King's life of civil rights, he spent 14 years, but he gave 2,500 speeches.
Wow.
He traveled 6 million miles to civil rights. The Montgomery bus boycott by itself lasted 382 days. The landmark itself is a showcase of his success, also the limitation to his success. So when he gave the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, D.C., one of the quotes that stood out enough to make a memorial, he states, "Out of a mountain of despair, a stone of hope." In the art, they make it literal. Essentially, he never separated himself from the despair of society he came from it. But him being a symbol of hope to that degree of success comes with a personal limitation. Because if Dr. Martin Luther King does not live, there's technically nobody who can fill his shoes. So when you look at the image, you can see every part of him is completed until you get to his feet. He fades off into obscurity. His legacy was cut short. In fact, Dr. Martin Luther King, the day before he was killed, gives you that insight. He says, "I've seen the mountaintop. I know us as a people will reach this mountaintop, but I don't think I'll be there with you." And the very next day, he was shot at the Lorraine Motel, Memphis, Tennessee, by James Earl Ray. But this limitation or this incompleted journey actually offers him an opportunity. Because in Washington, D.C., if you qualify as a statue, you're required by law to stop at 19 feet. So this isn't a statue, it's a sculpting. He doesn't feature his feet, or he doesn't feature the full details of his person. So he stands above the height of freedom and 30 feet tall. And that's also something directly related to MLK. So in 14 years, Dr. King was arrested 30 times for nonviolent offenses. The height of this memorial is literally his arrest record. One of the things that you can't directly associate with him is what he's holding. A lot of people assume that he's holding the I Have a Dream speech, but he gave it 3 times, and the one he gave in Washington, D.C. was literally a freestyle, so he can't be holding a speech that he didn't write. Instead of looking inward to his legacy, you look outward and see who he was inspired by. Here, across that body of water, one of the most controversial presidents known to America is Thomas Jefferson. And one of his most precious documents he was so proud of, he had it manufactured on his tombstone. The Declaration of Independence, the first sentence, he actually gets it from Thomas Paine's Common Sense. "We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equally." The Declaration of Independence. So, I'll leave you with this beautiful story. When this was dedicated, and it was actually dedicated on October 16, 2011, he shares that day with the anniversary of the Millions Men's March on Washington, 1995. There was the presence of a musician. His name was Stevie Wonder. And in Stevie Wonder's natural life, he never actually got a chance to meet Dr. King in person. So when he came here, he says, "I want to see the face." Now, Stevie Wonder was visually impaired, so that means technically it's impossible, but that's only if you use a narrow thought process, because he never needed his eyes to interpret the world around him. He used his hands. National Park Services, they brought a crane out. They hoist him 30 feet above ground. He feels the face. He says, "I finally get a chance to see the face of a beautiful man." He writes a $100,000 check to pay the efforts for it. Anybody with a visual impairment can feel the face of King. But one of the most interesting things about this memorial is that he's the only non-president here. Only African American, and everybody around him is a president. And he only needed half the time to be just as successful. People typically spend time trying to separate people because of their ideologies, but what's interesting is that Dr. King and Jefferson has that same concept of freedom. It's documented. So, When Thomas Jefferson was at the Second Constitutional Convention and they were deciding on the seal of America, we actually used the eagle. And there was a guy who wanted a turkey. That would make Thanksgiving difficult for me. But Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, they wanted Exodus. Literally the concept of the Israelites leaving Egypt. When Dr. Martin Luther King won his Nobel Peace Prize in Norway, in front of the committee, after he thanks them for the visit, he says, America has finally left Egypt. We're entering into the Red Sea that's been hardened by 200 years of degradation and despair. The same concept of liberation, just two different sides of the coin. From here, I want to let you guys explore the Dr. King Memorial. Meet me back at the bus in about 15 minutes. And FYI, this is going to be the last public restroom stop. And it's right across the street where it says gift store. You go behind it, that's the restroom. See you guys soon.
Cheers, boss.
Time right now, 11:40. Meet me back with the bus in the spot. Over here.
Yeah, we'll have to go there, won't we?
The better news is that every new stop we go to, the cardio decreases. Eventually, we're just going to be driving past them. The good news is that we only got 2 more stops on this beautiful campaign before I drop you guys off to the museum like babies at daycare.
I was enjoying this.
Well, I'll hide my excitement.
Okay.
This is a travesty. So, to your right hand side, you can see the entry of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. And the true perspective you're supposed to have from it showcases that these three stones are actually a part of a collective. In fact, all of the stones are pink salmon granite. You can actually find the Touir in China because it was sculpted by a Chinese American by the name of Lei Ye-shin. He was so successful at this form of art that he was personally recommended by 4 other people in the contest. It was actually created by the Roma Architect Institute. The landmark itself was all imported. So when you look at the description of Dr. Martin Luther King's imagery, it was finished on the 30th of December, 2010. It wasn't dedicated until nearly a year later. The reason why is that there was a few minor adjustments. A lot of people argued that it looked too Asiatic in its facial details, but that was naturally a bias. And then they also had a few back and forths about a quote that has since been removed. So you saw that one half of Dr. Martin Luther King's image, it didn't have a quote, but just a signature at the bottom, and there was a quote there. It was a quote that he gave, and it stated, "If I am to be a drum major, I will be a drum major for peace, equality, and justice." They actually paraphrased it, and it said, "I am a drum major for peace, equality, and justice," and because it said "I am" to such a degree, it was deemed to be self-serving of a person and speak of themselves at their own memorial. Maya Angelou didn't like the removal of the quote, but to your right-hand side, you can actually see a body of water. It's called the Tidal Basin. This body of water is pretty interesting because it was finished by an African-American engineer. He actually developed it. His name is Archie Alfonso Alexander. He was a graduate from Iowa State University. He's the first black graduate in engineering from that school, but he was also a football player, athlete, and intellect. He was their star left tackle, and it was actually during the time of a segregated sport team system, and so certain NCAA teams refused to actually play with him, including Alabama. So when he would take the field, they would refuse to play the game. Poor field loss, and that was the reason why there's one of the longest feuds between Iowa and Alabama. Significantly enough, he would go on to build the highway that connects Baltimore to Washington, D.C. He would also go on to build the airfield for the Red Cells, the Moulton Airfield, designed in Alabama by him. He won a Herman Award for Architectural Excellence in 1926. What's interesting about that body of water, though, is that it's become too small for the amount of water that flows inside, so it has flood, which I was excited of, because I know where the water goes. You can see that we have a slope that goes downward as you go further north. and the water flowed all the way to Constitution Avenue. And sitting on Constitution Avenue is the IRS. So the IRS was in 15 feet of water. That excitement only lasted for about 30 days because then they released the damage reports, and those are never exciting. For government buildings, it cost $13 million to restore the IRS. So if you pay taxes, that means they got you twice in the same tax year. Anyway, if you look to you guys' right-hand side, you can see what is known as the Forestry Department, and just beyond the Forestry Department, you can see the backdrop of the Holocaust Memorial Museum. On the back of the museum, there's an upside-down schoolhouse symbolic of the young lives who were forever changed by concentration camp. 1.5 million children died, 6 million Jewish people died. In a 5-year war, technically, the Night of Broken Glass, 1939. What's interesting about the Holocaust is that there's a few symbols that will forever remain prevalent because of it. One of them is misidentified. The swastika, at least in modern understanding, goes down as a very negative symbol. What's interesting is that the original swastika is Hindu. It means positively, tranquility, and well-being. If you look to you guys' right and left hand side, you can see that this is the Department of Agriculture. As we navigate through this area of Washington, D.C., to your upper right hand side, you can see the Energy Department dedicated to James Forrestal. If you look behind the Energy Department, you can see the International Spy Museum, and they do cover Revolutionary War history inside that museum, so you can see the legacy of James Amistad, the American spy who played both sides to help George Washington win the war. If you look to you guys' left-hand side, you can see a red building there. It's called the Smithsonian Castle, and that's the oldest Smithsonian we have in Washington, D.C. It's been in that location since 1855. Then if you look to you guys' left-hand side here, you can see what is known as the National Museum of African Art, and that museum is pretty amazing because it also features the art collection of Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist. He collected Western African art. He had over 2,000 pieces in his personal collection. One of the most interesting things about Frederick Douglass himself that he actually died a millionaire. If you look to you guys' right-hand side, you can see what is known as the Federal Aviation Administration, dedicated to the Wright brothers. They actually have a connection to Black history because they befriended a poet in high school. They went to Central High School in Ohio, and the poet's name is Paul Laurence Dunbar. Orville Wright and Paul Laurence Dunbar, while high school students, actually created a newspaper for Black people. It was called the Dayton Tattle. If you look to your right-hand side here, you can see the Eisenhower Memorial. The marble building we just passed was called the Transportation Department. As it pertains to ground or air travel, it wouldn't be successful without the GPS, which was actually a Black invention, developed by a female. Her name is Gladys West. Just like being able to fly in the winter, that's also a Black invention. African American, his name was Lucien Arthur Heading, 1917, just like the traffic light. Garrison Morgan, being sarcastic, just like the folding chair, but just like the train car. Andrew Beard, just like the light filament. Lamont Lattimore. There's a stark difference between a successful inventor and the person who owns the patent. It's when the patent office was integrated, 1921. The person who established the patent system was Thomas Jefferson. One of the most interesting things that Thomas Jefferson would be a part of, it also helps you understand his legacy. He was actually a paleontologist. In fact, Thomas Jefferson is the president who made a discovery. It's even named after him. It's called the Megalodonyx. That translates to long claw. Thomas Jefferson, is, in his enthusiasm in 1797, thought it was a cat, but it wasn't. It was a 9-foot land sloth. While he was a president, he actually financed a journey for Lewis and Clark, and they went to Yukon. They discovered the American woolly mammoth. That actually gives you an understanding of how he saw evolution through the lens of Darwinism. If you were a believer in that, you also had to accept the side components or the biases within, like neurogenics. Benjamin Banneker, the person who disproved this limited intellectual property, was also an inventor. He developed America's first completely functional wooden clock, and it actually worked for 50 consecutive years. And directly in front of you now, you can see the U.S. Capitol building, the legislative branch of government, or where nothing is accomplished at all. I'm joking. They just banned TikTok, so for you youthful people in America, you have 261 days left.
I'm excited. Anyway, if you look to you guys' right hand side, you can see the Capitol building. This is the side where Maya Angelou would give the inaugural form for Bill Clinton. This is also the side that Amanda Gorman will repeat that legacy. This is also the side that they swore in Barack Obama, the first African American president in 2009. There were so many people in the National Mall. They were standing from the U.S. Capitol to the Washington Monument. That's 1.8 million people in attendance, 1.6 miles away from the U.S. Capitol. The first person to take a seat on the lawn was none other than Denzel Washington. If you look to your right hand side at the top of the Capitol, you can see one of the largest components of Black history. You see that statue? It's called the Statue of Freedom. It's a symbol of American liberation, but it's also a statue that's a Greek. It's the Greek goddess Minerva. She's symbolic of protection. What's significant about that statue is who finished it. See, it was designed by Thomas Crawford, but it was finished by an African American from Louisiana. His name was Philip Reed. He was the only engineer who can finish it, so he was paid. His agreed upon daily salary from 1862 to 1863 was $1.25 a day. What's unique is that that was one of the highest contracts of that time for a person of his magnitude, but he wouldn't be privy to receiving every day of his pay. He would only receive one day of his weekly pay. For the completion of a 15,000-pound statue, he was paid a total of $44.25. Being generous, using about 3.5% inflation from 1862 to 2024, that would be the equivalent of getting paid $80,000 to finish a statue. What's significant about that statue is that that statue was placed at the top of the Capitol building when Africans in America were started to be quantified as people within a year of emancipation. American history. The first government system to actually exist in this country was called the Virginia House of Burgesses, been around since 1619. That's also the first year a slave ship arrived in Point Comfort, Virginia, which is 181.6 miles away from here. It only took 43 years for them to start to manage law so that the new children of those people who were imported to this country by way of slave ship to be classified. I guess there was a new type of woman in town and they were quite fond. So they were having children. And in 1662, in the Virginia House of Burgesses, they approved the law. It's actually from Greek. The Greek terminology would be partis secutor ventrum. In America, it's called the hereditary slave law. Any person born through the womb of a slave inherits that life. What's interesting is that that understanding wasn't changed until the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, but it didn't become permanent standard until about 3 years later. The first Civil Rights Act in this country was 1866. It's the African American birthright. But I want to take you to see every American's long lost cousin. He's Italian. Well, some people think he's Spanish. He's from the Republic of Genoa, but he was actually financed by the Spanish, and then he was financed by the Portuguese. Everybody knows him. He sailed the ocean blue, 1492. I said he was your long lost cousin. He was said to be on a quest for India. He discovered the Caribbeans, Bahamas. He then discovered the Dominican Republic. Then he discovered Puerto Rico. He went back. He was actually financed by King John II. The reason why he is directly connected with African American history is because of the things he would acquire when he came to the Western world. He typically took them back. In his own personal log or his diary, air quotes, he befriended 9 indigenous. And he took them across the Atlantic Ocean to Spain, and he propositioned Queen Isabella to use them as laborers, air quotes, and through his endeavors to the Western world, over 5,000 Taino Indians ended up back in Spain. You have to look deeper into Spanish history to understand exactly what I'm saying. Because in Spain, they were actually banning different cultures. That means if you were not Christian, you couldn't be there unless you converted, and in 1450 they banned the Sephardics. I'll let you Google their last name. And the Sephardics went to Africa. In fact, if you study African history, on the coastline of West Africa, there's an island. It's called Cape Verdean, and since 1456, they've been speaking Creole. You go to Spain when Christopher Columbus was finally taking his journey, and they were actually banning the Moorish. I'll summarize it. Here's how you look at world geography. The largest mass of black people in the world is in Nigeria. The second largest mass of black humans on Earth is in Brazil. There was 12.4 million people taken from Africa to the Americas, and only 500,000 came to the America by boat. Others went to Central and South America. He sailed the ocean blue in 1492. What's interesting about this community is that it's called Capitol Hill. But welcome to Chocolate City. So, just a trivial fact at this point, anytime a city population within the United States of America reaches a population of over 70%, they call it Chocolate City. What's unique about that phrase is that it actually comes from Congress. There's a book. There's always a book. It's called The Field of Blood. It explains Congress before the Civil War. And in Washington, D.C. in the 1850s, there was a population of 3,000 slaves within the District of Columbia. But with that population of 3,000 slaves, there was actually 12,000 people who were free. They noticed this imbalance. It wasn't natural to them. So they gave it a very unique political slur. They called Washington, D.C. Chocolate City. And by the 1980s, Washington, D.C. went through such a demographic influx of African Americans that they called it Chocolate City yet again, but they had a more of a positive spin. What's unique about this community is that the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar lived here along with 400 other black families in the 1880s and 1890s. But now, every building you see in this beautiful community is $1 million estate. I'm taking you to a place that's so historically African American that there's a statue that was dedicated by Frederick Douglass himself. And he dedicated this statue in 1874. But with that, I also have to extend you beautiful people the courtesy of 2 warnings. Here's the first. The community that we're going into is called Lincoln Park, and they're currently using the park as a dog park. So watch your step. Because if you step in German Shepherd, you can't wear your shoes on my bus. Alright? Especially if you step in Chihuahua. Those dogs have the worst nutrition in life. Second, one of the statues you're going to get a chance to see here could be deemed very sensitive or unpalatable material. Viewer discretion is advised. But one thing about art is that most art are time period pieces. Unless it's based on the concept of an unseen future, typically in order to understand the art correctly, you have to put your mind in the time frame of which it was designed. And I'll do my best to give you all the nuance of the statue.
Oh,
All right, so a very complex imagery. Um, in order to understand it correctly, you have to understand that it was dedicated in 1876, finished in 1874. This was actually paid for by African Americans. Newly liberated citizens actually dedicated this statue on reconstruction. They spent $18,000 to finish it. It was designed by a black man by the name of Thomas Baldwin. It was dedicated by Frederick Douglass. Now, society as a whole has very mixed reviews of it. The reason why they have mixed reviews is because they can only interpret the art through the lens they have of society. And when you see Abraham Lincoln like this, it kind of confuses you. But when Frederick Douglass saw it, he immediately hated it. And his hatred was just enough for him to like it. Why? Because not all history is meant to be consumed. Not all history is meant to be easy. But if you don't have the history, you'll forget it ever happened. So when he gives a speech, he says in a very harsh language, and I'm cleaning it up, Abraham Lincoln is not my president. He's the other man's president. Interestingly enough, you can't judge a person by way of what they do in the public, because when Abraham Lincoln had a chance to emancipate in 1861, he denied it. He says, according to mandates in America and laws that are being passed, African Americans are being systematically positioned to be no more than stepchildren to the country we built. So with the freedom you currently have, do something to progress society, because if you don't, you'll quickly and abruptly return to the shackles you just so nearly escaped. And so when you give it a modern look, you don't see equality, you don't see emancipation, you see a subservient person said to be free, but he still has shackles around his wrist. But that's honestly something that's been around since 1865, December 6th, when they officially ratified the 13th Amendment, because the 13th Amendment was actually drafted in the means of only abolishing one variation of slavery, chattel. But if you break the law, because it says except for those of which who break the law. And so, who makes the law? They can actually make black codes where you can be arrested for being homeless. And because now you're in prison, the prison can do with your body what they want. So they create the prison leasing system. And who would they lease you to? In the 1800s, it would take you right back to the plantation you just escaped from.
wow.
So it became a pathway for two corporations to get paid: former owner and the government. What's interesting about this statue is that there's two people here. And the one crouched below Abraham Lincoln is very famous because of his family lineage. In fact, he is the 5-time grandfather of American boxer Muhammad Ali.
Wow.
His name was Archer Alexander. And you heard of him in Vietnam because Cassius Clay changed his name. He joined the Nation of Islam. He was now going behind Muhammad Ali. And he refused to be drafted with one contingency: if you don't call me who I am, I won't get drafted. He actually goes to the draft board. He stands in a line and go down the line, and they call everybody by their government name. And when they came to Muhammad Ali, they continuously called him Cassius Clay. And because my government name is changed, that is not my identity. He stood in line, he was arrested, he was facing 5 years in prison, he would have several interviews without a boxing match, he was losing a lot of money. He said, still, I'm not joining the American Army because I've suffered more in the last 250 years in this one country than any Viet Cong could ever do to me. He says, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was revolutionary. And the interviewer goes to the length of trying to slightly embarrass him. So he asks, what's your great-grandfather's name? And quickly, Muhammad Ali says, Archer Alexander, because he did his family lineage. And that connects you right back to Washington, D.C., right here. You can see the ancestor of Cassius Clay from Missouri, and he was a fugitive slave. He refused to be arrested and kept in bondage. And during Reconstruction, he became a model for this very image. And this was completely African-American community. So he was dedicating it in front of a group of 25,000 black people, and the president at the time was actually in attendance, Ulysses S. Grant, who passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875 for education rights. If you look across this park, though, you can see a pioneer that many people acknowledge exists, but they don't know or they can't quantify exactly how much of her legacy plays directly into the black journey. Her name is Mary McLeod Bethune, and typically people say she's the namesake of Bethune-Cookman University, and then I ask, well, what else? Because if she only made a university, I'd argue she doesn't deserve a statue in Washington, D.C. And what's interesting about that statue is the first female statue in this entire city. And there's only three. You have Mary McLeod Bethune, have Queen Isabella from Spain, and you have Eleanor Roosevelt. And outside of Washington, D.C., every other female statue is an allegorical depiction. These are the only three literal. But when you go into the Capitol, they actually just dedicated a statue of Daisy Bates. We're going to go to her so you can see her image. And I'm going to explain exactly why she's here and why she belongs here. Her first school wasn't even Bethune-Cookman. That was actually her second school. In fact, her first school was called the Literary and Industrial Institution for Negro Girls. And she started it in the same place that she would Bethune-Cookman, Florida. She actually starts her first school with just $1.50. And she would actually teach over 10,000 students how to read and write with elderberry and charred wood. What's interesting about her journey is that she was more than just an educator. In fact, her first community outreach organization was called the National Association of Colored Women, and she establishes this in 1924. And in 1924, she has over 800,000 members. She actually uses that platform to become a government affiliate. She works for three presidents: Herbert Hoover, Calvin Coolidge, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. For Herbert Hoover and Calvin Coolidge, she was actually an affiliate, a part of child welfare. For Franklin Delano Roosevelt, she was actually an official secretary. She was the Secretary of Youth Affairs in 1933, so according to the Smithsonian, she's the first black woman to have a presidential secretarial position. But then in 1937, she became the Secretary of African American Affairs. They called it Negro Affairs back then. She was a part of FDR's alternative cabinet. But then in 1941, she actually leveled up again. She joins the military, and she's in her 60s. She actually creates what they call the Women Army Artillery Corporation, or the Organization of Female Regiment, the 68888. They were even deployed to World War II, Italy. They were actually responsible for fixing the mail problem because they had 4 facilities and over 10 months of backlog mail. So she hires 850 black women, and in 2 weeks they fix a 10-month issue. But then in 1954, she creates what we call the National Negro College Fund. But then in 1935, she actually creates an organization that we still know today. They're called the National Council of Negro Women. And in 2021, they won a lawsuit against Johnson & Johnson for the manufacturing of talcum powder. But that wouldn't be all. See, one of the biggest pieces of understanding black history is the month we celebrate, February. And typically, you give that understanding to the person who wrote the book. His name is Carter G. Woodson. But he wrote the Journal of African American History in 1916. It wasn't until 1922 that he moved to Washington, D.C., and he met this young lady. And she forced him to mass produce the book and promote it. And their method of promotion was actually choosing the first week of February to celebrate what we call Black History Week in 1926. So that means she's one of the co-founders of Black History Week. And in that month, they barely even discuss her legacy. You get 3 people: Malcolm X, Dr. Martin King, Rosa Parks, and some Frederick Douglass if we're lucky. So when you look at these 2 images, you can't think of them as separate pieces of art, because everything you see on the opposite side is completely opposite here. Mary McLeod Bethune, in a psychological term, is Abraham Lincoln's cognitive dissonance. Juxtaposition, diametric opposition. Significantly enough, you can see the students here standing. They're actually full in acceptance of what she's delivering. She has a closed scroll that's symbolic of her legacy. Her legacy is education. She deems it the greatest equalizer that any American can have, but for certain Americans, you can't rely on the same institution that created the division to hand you the equality, which is why education shouldn't start in school. It should start at the kitchen table. Certain things they're just not going to tell you. And here's an example of that. On the opposite side, you can see Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's statue has a scroll that's completely open. That's the Emancipation Proclamation. It's like what Grandma says: if you want to keep it secret, you should probably put it in a book. Here's a fun fact about that document. The last state to actually ratify it did it in 1995. Mississippi. And that entire document was drafted as a military acquisition, but if you look at the public school books, it says Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation. Here's another fun fact. We currently have a holiday that's called Juneteenth because Texas was the last area to liberate slaves. There's nuance to that. It was the last Confederate territory to free the slaves. The last states to abolish slavery were Delaware and Kentucky. It's after the 13th Amendment. Just like saying the 4th of July is America's Independence Day. When the last battle of the Revolutionary War was in 1781, you can't have independence until the war is over. Which is why during the Civil War, the French stayed neutral until they had a definitive winner. And then, in the Revolutionary War, it ended with King George III signing the Treaty of Paris that was ratified on January 14th of 1784. So July 4th is basically when 3 presidents died. Just like the country, America, didn't officially abolish slavery until the 13th Amendment. This is why the last 2 states to abolish slavery were in the Union, because it's about money. So it's not a North and South thing, it's where the money flows thing. The first slave ship manufactured in the U.S. was in Massachusetts. The first slave auction place was in Wall Street. In fact, if you go to New York City today, if you go to Wall Street today, the very beginning of it is still known as the municipal slave market. Just like the first general that Abraham Lincoln recruited was Robert E. Lee. Never mind. From here, I'm going to let you guys enjoy the sight. I'm going to do you guys one favor. I'm going to pull the bus down so we don't have to do that much cardio. See you soon.
Oh, go ahead.